Hello again, everybody. The previous slide was containing a few facts concerning Darwin, and now we're going to talk about natural selection. Natural selection is a key concept in Darwin's theory of evolution. And we can quote his book. His masterpiece is called On the Origin of Species. It was published in 1859. And that's what he says in this book. As many more individuals of each species are born that can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. So, I have been putting in boldface a few words. First sub-concept in the idea of natural selection is that everywhere there is a struggle for existence. It means that more individuals of any species come to life than can possibly survive. You can imagine that if sudden death or accidental death or death from disease would not occur in species like the human species, or in ants, or in pigs, or in whatever species, it would be simply unbearable for the Earth, and we would have an exponentially growing population. And the population, even if it grows in our species, is not that exponentially growing. And in most studies of population genetics, etc., we take the assumption of a population with constant size. And this assumption is not completely nonsensical. So, first observation is that more individuals come to life than can possibly survive. So, death will happen, and accidental death, or death not only by just the effect of aging, will happen. So there is this idea that there is a competition for existence, and that some individuals are fitter than others. So the idea is that if you have in your phenotype, in your observable characteristics, some features that make it easier for you to survive, then you will have, obviously, a better chance to survive, and then you will give more offsprings to the next generation. That's what Darwin says by naturally selected. Death will spare this individual that is highly adapted to its environment, and death will take the individual that is poorly adapted to its environment. So they already at the time of Darwin, even if they didn't know, of course, the structure of the DNA and the mechanisms of meiosis, of the mechanisms the molecular mechanisms by which an individual is conceived or is fabricated from two gametes. Even if they didn't know about this, they understood that there was a principle of inheritance. There was a mechanism of inheritance of some traits from one individual to their offspring. So, struggle for existence first, varying conditions of life, so the environment changes, and the environment is such that some individuals are more adapted to it than others. And third principle, the principle of inheritance, makes it that the genes, what we call now genes, the pooled genes of the individuals that are better suited to their environment, this pooled gene will be overrepresented in the next generation compared to the pooled gene of the gene pool, of the individuals that were not adapted to their environment, or were not as well adapted to the environment. So that's natural selection. On the left of this slide, you see what some people said called the first example of a phylogenetic tree. So it was a sketch on one of Darwin's notebooks before he wrote on the origin of species, and he was taking notes, and this note was about the transmutation of species. And on this tree, Darwin wanted to show that the current species that we see come from a common ancestor, and they have derived from this common ancestor with branching patterns, what we call speciation events now. So Darwin was trying to understand what was the transmutation of species, what were the processes at work behind the fact that species evolve and some disappear because they could see. And remember that Darwin was a geologist, so he was used to studying fossils. One could easily see that there were living forms millenniums ago that no longer exist on this planet. So some species are extinct. This was the first observation. Second observation, species are not fixed, and that was not really. That was an observation by Darwin. Based on what he saw, for instance, in the Galapagos archipelago, he saw that very closely related species, or species that looked almost the same, had evolved in the different islands of the Galapagos into different species, and different species adapted to different environments, etc., etc. So that's something you will see in your practical for this session. So, yeah, these species are differentially distributed. Differentially distributed means that on one island you find a set of species that is not the same set as the set of species on another island, yeah, so that's the observations on the Galapagos Islands. From these observations, Darwin inferred that maybe one species does change into another. And this one species changing into another, obviously at that time was not well understood, but it's a key concept also in the Darwinian theory of evolution. As we saw on the previous slide, there is variation in offspring, in the descendants, to adapt and alter the race to changing world. Okay, so the idea is that we will see some features that are positively selected or naturally selected in the offspring to adapt to the environment, and this environment changes also. Okay, so character variation and fixation of changes in a population provide the mechanisms of speciation. We'll come back to that later, but you understand that for a species to be called such, to be called a different species from its ancestor species, you understand that somehow the changes, these variations that are passed from one generation to the next, must become fixed characteristics of a certain species to make it different from the other sister species, let's say, that has evolved from the same ancestral species. Sorry. A great contribution by Darwin also was the idea of common descent. Darwin was the first one, or one of the first scientists, to get the intuition that maybe all living organisms have evolved from the same single ancestor. Because if you acknowledge that species evolve, and if you acknowledge that they transmute into different species, it makes sense to have such a tree as we've seen in this slide 11. And then time is something that evolves along these branches, or these branches are created along time. And there is a point, maybe here, maybe there, that is the oldest point in time, and at that time there was only one species. And Darwin says this in these words, on The Origin of Species: there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one. So it wasn't clear at that time in Darwin's mind whether there were few initial species at the beginning of the history of life on Earth, or only one. And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So you see, we can draw a parallel between this and the idea of evolution of species as understood by Lamarck. You remember that Lamarck said that probably species evolve from the most simple to the most complex, and we find a similarity here when Darwin says, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, etc. So just to wrap up on Darwinian theory of evolution, a few remarks. Very important to understand that the idea that there is a pressure, or there is a struggle for survival, there is a pressure about limited resources on Earth, and therefore the fact that some people will die because they are not, some individuals, will die because they are not well adapted to their environment. They cannot find their ways to survive in the environment. That's a key point in the Darwinian theory of evolution, that there is this struggle for life. And nowadays we can see that the way the evolution takes place differs whether there is a strong selective pressure or not from the environment, from the conditions in the environment. So a key difference now between Darwin and the earlier theory by Lamarck is that Darwin understood that there is no real direction, and that's maybe what opposes nowadays the theory of evolution with the other theory of creationism that is promoted by some people, sometimes on religious grounds. Darwin says it's absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. So in Darwin's view, it's absurd to say that we human beings are higher than ants. Ants are very well adapted to their environment, and it's highly probable that various species of insects will outlive us human beings on this planet. So doesn't really mean anything to say that some living systems are higher than others. We just evolved into different directions, but all directions make sense. So evolution is an omnidirectional process, and evolution has no fixed goal. Okay, the goal is not fixed. The goal is to adapt to the environment, and the environment changes, and so we cannot say that there is a goal in evolution. As I said just now, ants are as perfect as human beings, and similarly, human beings are subject to disease, and animals as well. So we are as imperfect as any other species. Of course, human beings are animals. There is a continuity of characters between us and our closest siblings in the tree of life, so monkeys and apes. And this has been demonstrated now by the huge amount of equal bases in our DNAs. If you compare the DNA of Homo sapiens with the DNA of Pan troglodytes, you see that there is obviously a very, very high similarity. So that wasn't very well received, of course. This statement that human beings are animals at that time, while the religious ideas were quite strongly in place in Europe. So of course, yeah, it was a source of public outcry or public debate. Sexual selection plays a role in evolution. Yes, that's also a remark by Darwin that apart from natural selection being adapted to your environment, Darwin could see that there is competition also in mating. So when individuals of a species find their sexual partners to have offspring, it's obvious, and it has been studied, that there are preferences in mating, and very often partners choose a partner that can yield the highest chances for the offspring to survive. So there is a tendency to choose some partners rather than others. So that's what we call sexual selection, and it plays a role in evolution. Diseases also play a role, because diseases are obviously one of the factors that contribute to negative selection. Negative selection by death is the contrary of positive selection by a high fit to the environment. And Darwin's breakthrough opened the way for modern molecular evolutionary science, because nowadays scientists are busy day after day discovering actually the principles, or showing that the principles of Darwin's evolution theory are in action in our world. I said earlier that Darwin was aware that there was inheritance of traits between individuals and their offsprings. And while Darwin was busy also publishing his works, and remember, The Origin of Species, On the Origin of Species is a book dated 1859, of course. At that time also, Georg Mendel, from Austria, I think, yes, he was a monk, so he had lots of time to meditate, which is a good thing, and he also took lots of time to hybridize garden peas, and he discovered some laws of inheritance, He was hybridizing garden peas, and hybridizing means forcing reproduction between specific individuals, and looking for some characteristics or phenotypic features in the descendants. So, for instance, if you see this Punnett square here on the left, okay, this is the modern vision of things. If you've done a little bit of genetics. So let's take the example in this Punnett square of a single locus trait. So let's imagine that the color of a flower is the result of one locus, and this one locus has two alleles, uppercase B and lowercase b. And one allele is dominant, that's allele uppercase B, one allele is recessive, allele lowercase b. So recessive means that to be expressed, of course we are talking here about a diploid organism, so every single trait for any individual has two alleles for any any trait, any locus. So if you have the two recessive alleles, you express the recessive trait. Otherwise, if you have a combination of a dominant and a recessive, or two dominant alleles, then you have the dominant trait. So this was discovered by Mendel just by simply hybridizing lots of plants, and he could witness, there is this, in many of my experiments, there is this proportion of 25% versus 75%. So how comes I have 25% of white flowers and 75% of purple flowers in the next generation? So he formulated some laws, 2 laws, and it was the birth of modern genetics. And it was almost 1 century before Watson and Crick unveiled the structure of DNA, and that we understood that, how is it that we have 2 alleles for every single every locus? It's because we have 2 chromosomes, etc., etc. And the structure of the DNA in these chromosomes has been discovered in 1953. The first law by Mendel is that he understood that I'm busy studying a species that is diploid, so you have 2 alleles for each trait, and they segregate during meiosis. First law. Second law is that alleles are passed independently from each other, from parents to offspring. And we'll see later how is this possible that these alleles are passed independently. So important observation by Mendel is that there was something hidden. Of course, it's not just because there is something hidden in the association between what is visible, and the invisible genetic information. So in this 75 and 25%, what is hidden is the idea that you have this recessive allele and the dominant allele. And so there's no one-to-one association between what you can see and the genotype that you cannot see. Let's have a break now.